Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out. The best way to do this is two ways, email and YouTube. Okay, so it won't be hard to find me. I'm on a lot of different platforms when it comes to podcasts. But also, it doesn't hurt to share, tell your friends. All you got to do is type in the Harboring Light. That's me. All right, so on to the topic here. So I'm going to continue out and finish, as I said, talking about political labels. Here we go. Okay, so I found it quite interesting, the rest of the information that I found. And so now what I'm going to focus in on the other part of it from the other source, the Lumen, about all the political affiliations and labels. So what I'm going to do is, of course, give my opinion. And then, round it out with the rest of the facts here and towards the end. All right, so it's quite interesting. I'm going to rehash and I'm going to talk about the aspects of the federalism, James Madison, and all of that. So, what I ended off about the aspects of infraction, right, and the system, and then also with the aspects of really not the founding fathers really looking towards the imminent danger of, uprise of overuse or abuse of parties. Parties one over the other, right? And so, this was really refreshing reading all this information, because it was a refocus, things that I knew about. And it's always good to go back, look, and reinform, and get the idea about the concepts that you have learned. So, it was quite interesting when I was getting into the midst of it. It was saying about the aspects how Republicans of today are not, among other things, they're not as quite different from what we think about Republicans now, good or bad, right? So, pretty much, George Washington had the idea, and this is how we got the uprising of the Whiskey Rebellion and everything like this, and then, leading into the 1912 war, Civil War, and everything after that. So, again, what it boiled down to was people had very specific ideas of where their loyalties lie, right? And so that's what seeped in to the difference between Democratic Republican, hence Democratic Republican, in the beginning of the Constitution of the 13 colonies and everything else of our country, to the Republican Party, which was mainly Democratic Republican Party, was focuses in on the aspects of free range between what is your kind of sort of ally getting that idea of, from what I understand, feel free to reach out to me. correct me. Give me your viewpoints, with your thoughts, if you feel the need to do so. Who is my ally? That's what I took from it. Who is my ally here? Okay. Whereas the Republican ideology was all about the rise and the taking forth of where's the balance between what the citizens feel and what the citizens say, my disposition, and the government. Where is the balance between all these things, right? And so when Hamilton came into rise and everything, it was quite interesting. And that was a different element too. And then that's when you saw the brutality and and what was really justified in the founding fathers and seeing, because you saw people, accounts of politicians getting up fights and everything just because you don't align with what I think. Just the early on with that, you and insurgents and all of these kind of things. And so what broke the breaking point was at that time to even more subjugate what is thought of about democracy, Republican ideas, Civil War. Because out of the Civil War, now that wasn't the only focal point of the Civil War, slavery, but it was a huge issue. It was a huge polarizing issue of that time. There's a lot of issues that were going on when it comes to the aspects of land division, the aspects of seceding from the Union, wanting to, people feeling like they don't have much of freedom or a say-so as they're, intending to have, and all these things. And this is how this is division between what is thought of, where it got murky and where things got blurred in lines with what is thought of, or what is a Democratic disposition, what is a Republican disposition. If you look back on it, from other people accounting about it, what you read when you're in school, you get the pretty version where it makes it look at like that the people who were in favor, even though slavery wasn't a whole issue here, who were in favor of keeping slaves were Republicans, and the Democrats, oh, no, they were more free thinking, when that really wasn't the case. Okay? So we go on into, remember I said earlier on Monday, and I said this before, that words actually mean something. And then you always have to be mindful for people who try to twist and manipulate and make it seem as if words don't mean anything. And I recreate the meaning of something just to prove a ridiculous point that they have. So now progressive ideas mean quite different now than it did then. So we get on to, first we get into the political machines, right? And so that was a really case in point when the Industrial Revolution started to come about, as I said. And how the Industrial Revolution itself really impact the way in which people moved and thought about themselves and their disposition in the world, especially in the modernized world. And so here in America, right, America, land of the free, land of opportunity, regardless of what people want to say, good or bad, or what people want to say about capitalism, capitalism works. And capitalism is the true foundation, I think, for freedom. But see, here's the problem with capitalism, which a lot of people don't really want to talk about, or, people talk in circles when it comes to it, or there's a whole lot of things. But there are people who have a nuanced idea about it. That you also have to take account of the human condition of greed. Okay, so this was really revealing this ugly head when political machines were taking a hold of the political system in this time era. And they went on a very profound cartoonist. Let me pull his name up right here just to rehash my memory, okay? Hold on. Okay. Thomas Nast cartoons. Now, he was really in the taking in the forefront of visually representing something, and visually for in history, in the counterpoints of that, for visually understanding that what you represent, what you say means, can really translate and can really profound people to think. And his cartoons are a really good example, and were a really good example, and are really a good example now, because it changed the foundation to, get people into thinking how to read, how politics are thought of in newspaper, all the way to they say in this source here, all the way to newspapers, all the way to media, right? And so his cartoons reiterated the impact of how very strong visuals that are easily to identify what they mean can impact and influence. All right. And he was really the forerunner of doing that. And more so because at that time, people were more illiterate, than they are today. Now, it's unfortunate, even though people are, more vast or more literate, but I guess you can say the downfall of technology. Some people are heavily limited in the way in which they read and think about the process of reading and literacy. So there's a nuance to that, when it comes to that. So anyhow, there's that. Now, going back to the progressive ideologies, this is when we get into having political systems that are ran on merit, right? Supposed to be ran on merit, and this is when you get into the idea of more emotions are involved in the decision making of the political candidates, right? And so this is when the era of this is really enforced a lot. And if I'm not mistaken, first in the 1880s, and then which leaked in to civil service with the merit system. Then we get in the New Deal with Roosevelt, right? So with the New Deal, the New Deal was supposed to be this government implementing improvements, where it be socialist, and some of them socially involved, and they asked, using socialist tactics in order to bring in revenue for American people, and revenue into the cities, and more work, more being the economy to be more lucrative. Because after the disaster of the 20s and learning from that impact, and then we get, when we get in the 30s, people are really just a hellscape, because there's just, not a real tight-knit plan for how to remedy the devastation that the economy took when it struck out and from the late 20s, okay? And so this whole idea of the uprise of the common man, these images and this ideology was very, presenting itself a lot with the difference between democratic ideas, right, and then Republican ideas, and these ideas really associating themselves, softly associating themselves with not being disassociating themselves, you say, with not being upheaved with communist ideas, because from my understanding, when you get in that arena, with propaganda and everything, is, oh, we're doing this for the common good, right? For all of you, we're all doing this for all of you, but that doesn't that's all well and good on the surface on paper. That doesn't recollect and recount, as I said, for greed, because 9 times out of 10 there's going to be some selfish person in power that's really doing things that are not in the best interest for the society as a whole, for the people as a whole, and that's where it falls flat with communism. Okay. All right. So, we get into, as I said, with Nest and the influence and everything, and the New Deal and all this progressive ideologies. Then we get into the movements. Now, I found it interesting, the candidate central politics, right? This is where you don't necessarily the president who are running, the candidates who are running, whether it be all the way for the highest power, which is president, and all the way to different levels of government representation, in the House. It's driven by personal interest, right? Now, they said in the source that the first really good example of this was Jimmy Carter, where he went face to face, door to door. And before then, the division between, when we get back in the era of George Washington, there was the Democratic Republicans. They would go door to door, pass out pamphlets, and be very progressive in influencing people that way. And so this was re-innovated back again, right? And so I would say, to add on to this, they say Jimmy Carter, but I think they felt to, I don't know if that's a personal choice or what the decision was to omit that out, was how JFK fundamentally understood the impact of television at the time. Because when he ran, against Nixon didn't lost because he wasn't plugged in. He said, television is a faded novelty. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to help me. What's going to help me is my policies, right? Now, JFK understood, no, you know what? No, we have to merge. Image is everything. And so, unfortunately, that's really true. That's how he won. Because, now there's a saying where it's not what you know necessarily, is who you know and how you present yourself and how you look, right? So, that was a pivotal case in point in how, the political image was shaped. That is image quality is what's important to remember here. Look how you look, And so, and then it went into saying this overall idea that, and which is a really good case in point of Nixon. Going back to Nixon, he said, "Oh, my policies are what matter. Being, for I'm relying heavily on the public who want to support me, the constituents, right? You know, I'm saying it right. The people, the people who want to support me will elect me because they are informed, right? Now, it's funny because in the source that I just got my information from, reiterate in Lumen and the American government, right, says that, when we back into the merit decision making, civil era decision making of the Democratic people, and slowly losing the Republican forename of it. Also, what came along with that is the aspects here that heavily relying on the media to be the influence, not the informed viewer. Riddle me this, Batman. Now listen. That is very foretelling when we come into today. It's very foretelling into the foundation of the upheaval or the destruction of society. Now, if I'm not mistaken, there was a number one rule. It was either with Marxism or communism or something like that, infiltrating when it comes to modernity, when it comes to getting in the 20th century and so forth. In order for our ideas, propaganda is we're going to change the idea of how we go about with propaganda in this age. We're going to infiltrate through schools and media. Okay? That's that is the extreme of it. Okay? Now, case in point, what does this idea mean? A useful tool or a useful idiot, right? One is more complimentary, right? Because what does the word mean? Useful tool. Tools are what you use to accomplish something. But when you use something toward saying a useful idiot, what does that also mean? That means that, hold on, I'll be right back. All right, so getting back to everything. So what I said, all right, hashing back to what I said, okay? All right, so simple, useful tool. Like I said, a tool is supposed to be used to specifically achieve a goal and what you need. Use the tool to tighten something, or use the tool to, and when you get into the mechanics of electrical engineering or so forth, or soldering or something, to turn something on or what have you. All right. Now, the derogatory useful idiot, that takes a whole nother light, where somebody that's not well informed, you use them to your advantage in order to, gain a unscrupulous agenda. and make things seem as if they are right, but they're wrong. So why did I say this? Like I said it with animal farm, okay? And I said with John Soder with his telling and explaining of the book, is very mindful. George Orwell understood this very well, and he understood this when he was in 1984 in his other books, right? He understood this very well about the impact that government and power can have, and then the impact not only stripping yourself away from government and power, to really be honest about the, understanding of power and the aspects of humanity. Of, unfortunately, you can't always trust and believe that the merit will always be there with whoever is in power, okay? And so a lot of politicians understand this today, and they use that to their advantage. That's why they uphold people to, regurgitate all of this information that's misinformation. And this whole idea of this implementing what I mentioned previously in the facts that I found, that the new era of saying that politics you don't be heavily informed on politics, on understanding the information. On the information of policy. You just heavily rely on what the media is saying, or how things look. And see, that is a lot of downfall of why there's so much polarization now. You could say, on the devil's advocate, maybe that it was designed to be that way when with the new era, when you get the New Deal of progressive marriage ideologies, maybe that was the intention, to where setting up foot soldiers for that, right? Where people are just regurgitating what someone else said, but they don't really have the critical aspects to think otherwise or to view things differently. And so news media outlets take full advantage of that. Anywhere from local news all the way up to national news, all the way up to legacy media. Well, that's all legacy media. When you get paid, you pay for your news, where you get the CNNs and the NBCs and the Fox Newses, right? That, unfortunately, you can see how all these things make sense, of why things are so polarized as it is today, in its aspects of this very tribal. But that's something that goes with human nature, that you can't strict yourself away from, even though it's being presented as if what's biologically sound and uprooted in nature is wrong. That you can't go against what you naturally are apt to be, tribal and all these kind of things. And so the media gates understand these things, and so they use that to their advantage. So it can, unfortunately, most of the time, misinform people to be more emotional in their decision making when it comes to political ideas, or looking at the world around them from a political lens, or a cultural lens. You can see this a lot in our pop culture when you get into the ideas of the way disposition women and tradition is, when we get work and family. Even with the aspects of dress and attire for women, and the list goes on. There's a laundry list. Vice versa with men. The attitude in which it is with work and family, raising children, and there's aspects of being perpetually in a state of arrested development, that being upheld. And then also on the other end of women too, with the aspects of arrested development, but it's more appropriate because for whatever reason, the idea that, projecting this idea that, women are perpetually girls when, in a really strong society, there's a balance in between and the aspects of what women and men can bring to the table. That's more sound and really setting up, enlightenment and really security than anything else. And then also with the aspects of our military forces, the weird political agendas being influenced in that, because we need a strong military force, but whether people want to say this or not, and then gun force too, and all these things. You need that, and we need these checks and balances. We need all these things. We need police and government. We need all these things. And it helps uproot justice and law. And it's unfortunate there are bad players when it comes to this, but you got to see you got to rise and see the good and see and figure out, and because it takes time to figure out better solutions to something, instead of just being heavily involved in emotions and just to solve a problem, which no good comes from that. And so, all these things are something to be thought about, to wrap up when we think about political identity, where you align. And it's just fascinating to me how, can't stress enough, when you look back to history, don't keep looking back. History in itself, if you take the time to understand it, it really helps you to see where you're going. So with that said, feel free. I will greatly appreciate. That's all I got for today. So I will greatly appreciate you and your comments. Feel free to extend out this conversation, either through email or YouTube. With that said, this reaches the end of the Harvard Light. Tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care out there. Bye bye for now.